On February 20th, 1954, President Dwight Eisenhower made an unplanned visit to the dentist while on vacation in Palm Springs, California. However, many whistleblowers have come forward claiming this wasn't the case, stating that Eisenhower actually had a meeting with extraterrestrials. To this day, many debate which story is true. Was it simply a chipped tooth, or was there something more alien involved? This whole conspiracy would begin after Eisenhower seemingly disappeared while on a vacation in Palm Springs. On the night of February 20th, it said the president was eating fried chicken when he chipped the cap off his upper left central incisor. Eisenhower then rushed off, leaving his vacation home called Smoking Tree Ranch. He was then gone all night. One odd note is that during that time Eisenhower was gone, the Associated Press would report that, quote, Prez Eisenhower died tonight of a heart attack in Palm Springs. Only 2 minutes later, this would be retracted, and a report would make a statement saying Eisenhower was actually still alive. The president was then seen at a church back in Los Angeles the very next morning, telling reporters that he had to visit a local dentist and have an emergency treatment. He would even bring that dentist to an official function later that night and would present him as the dentist that treated him. Many were curious why the Associated Press made this false report, and a representative, Pankratz, would explain this by saying, somebody was fooling around and it went out. It wasn't supposed to go out, but it did. However, this whole story just seems suspicious to many. To begin with, the vacation was announced suddenly and only came a week after his previous vacation in Georgia. Then soon after the alleged dentist visit, several different people would come forward saying that the chipped crown was nothing more than a cover story to hide what really happened. A Navy intelligence officer, a CIA airplane pilot, and a National Security Council member are just a few of the people that would come forward with their own claims about this. Although the accounts have a slight difference, the main story within them stays the same. In their version of events, President Eisenhower actually made a secret trip to Edwards Air Force Base, formerly known as Muroc Airfield, where he had his first contact with alien life. He apparently met with 2 aliens, which were nicknamed Nordics because of their resemblance to Nordic humans, having pale skin, whitish hair, and light blue eyes. The Nordics allegedly telepathically made a request from Eisenhower, asking him to make an agreement to de-arm nuclear weapons in exchange for their superior technology and spiritual wisdom. However, Eisenhower declined this deal, worried that the US would be unable to defend itself without them. The Cold War was ongoing during this time frame, and the national security officials most likely wanted a better deal before making a deal with actual extraterrestrials. It's said shortly after this first encounter, Eisenhower would have a second meeting with aliens, but this time it was the Greys he would communicate with. It's said that they actually came to an agreement with the president agreeing to let them take humans and cattle from medical experiments on the condition they would be returned home unharmed. In return, we would have access to their more advanced technology, terms that, at the time, seemed completely reasonable to Eisenhower and his officials. This would later be known as the Greada Treaty in UFO lore. Since then, quite a few people have come forward about what really happened that February night. Many of these whistleblowers were trusted officials that had access to classified documents. Others were government insiders, all seemingly credible people. The very first man to come forward was an occultist and a Saucerian, Gerald Light. He may not be the most credible person, but he may have also started this whole conspiracy to begin with. In a famous letter to author and director of Borderland Science Research, Maid Lane, Light would be the first to claim Eisenhower went to Edwards Air Force Base and not the dentist that night. Light would make many other claims, such as, quote, 5 separate and distinct type of aircraft being studied and handled by our Air Force officials with the assistance and permission of the Etherians. He stated that he had been invited to the airbase that night as a spectator, meant to judge how the public would react to the aliens. He said, I have never seen so many human beings in a state of complete collapse and confusion as they realized that their own world had indeed ended with such finality as to beggar description. Light claims his information to be authentic, but it's also known that he's previously written articles involving psychic communication with extraterrestrials for Lane's magazine several times in the past. Commander of the Pacific Fleet and Naval Intelligence member William Cooper claims to have come across classified documents describing First Contact. Before he took the position of commander in 1970, he was required to review a number of documents, which he claims included top-secret projects involving extraterrestrials. Cooper would describe what he read, and in the process give us more background information on why the alleged meeting was happening in the first place. He would go into detail about 2 classified projects. The first was Project Sigma, which was aiming to make radio contact with a large spacecraft which had been sighted in high orbit above the equator. Cooper claims there were several huge alien ships and their true intent was unknown. Soon after, the second project would begin, Project Plato, which was tasked with creating diplomatic relationships with extraterrestrials. Plato would use computers and binary language in another attempt to make contact. And this attempt apparently was successful, resulting in a landing site and meeting place being agreed upon. Cooper states that before this meeting could take place, apparently the US government was contacted by a second group of aliens. These aliens were fairly humanoid and met with Eisenhower's officials to give us a warning. However, he does add that this all happened at Homestead Air Force Base and not at Edwards. These aliens warned us about contacting the other extraterrestrials above the equator, and they also offered to help us with our spiritual development. They insisted that we dismantle and destroy our nuclear weapons as their main condition, but refused to share any other technologies with us. The aliens stated that we weren't spiritually ready for any advanced technology, and they were worried that we would just use any new tech to destroy each other. They continued by saying we're on a road to self-destruction by plundering the Earth's resources, polluting, and just killing each other. These beings wanted to teach us to live in harmony with the Earth and with each other. This, however, was met with extreme suspicion from government officials. They worried that disarmament would also mean that we would be completely defenseless if any of these aliens turned out to be a threat. The United States didn't see this as an option, and the deal was rejected. Next is John Lear, who held 18 speed records, flew over 150 test aircraft, and was a contract pilot for the CIA for over 15 years. Lear flew planes in covert missions above Vietnam, and while doing this, formed a friendship with the man in charge of the operations. This man, William Colby, would later go on to be director of the CIA and allegedly would talk to Lear about some of the extraterrestrial documents he had come across. Apparently, we had indeed received a warning from one set of aliens before signing a treaty with the others. He also claims that this did happen at Edwards Air Force Base, stating that in 1954, President Eisenhower met with a representative of an alien species. These aliens suggested that they could help us get rid of the Greys that were still in high orbit above the Earth's equator. Lear says Eisenhower had to reject this offer because they didn't offer us any technology. Charles Sugg Jr., a retired sergeant from the U.S. Marines, claims his father, Charles Sugg Sr., was present at Edwards Air Force Base the night of first contact. Sugg Sr. was a commander with the U.S. Navy for years before retiring and passing away in 1987. In a 1991 interview with Charles Jr., he would go on to recount stories he had heard from his father over the years. He claims his father accompanied the president and other officials to Edwards Base, where they had a meeting with two Nordic aliens. They had white skin and hair, pale blue eyes, and colorless lips. Sugg Sr. also saw a saucer standing on tripod legs with a ramp extending from it. However, the Nordics wouldn't let him come any closer to inspect it. These aliens told them that they came from a different solar system, and they also had many detailed questions for us about our nuclear testing. Some of these whistleblowers implied that the treaty was signed, but we didn't necessarily have a choice in the matter. A former Air Force serviceman and a classified aviation project member, Don Phillips, testified to have seen documents involving first contact. He claims these document details the meeting between Eisenhower and both sets of extraterrestrials, as well as the background leading up to this encounter. Phillips once stated, "We have records from 1954 that were meetings between our own leaders of this country and ETs here in California. And as I understand from the written documentation, we were asked if we would allow them to be here and do research. I have read that our reply was, well, how can we stop you? You are so advanced." Then we have Colonel Philip Corso, who served on Eisenhower's National Security Council for 4 years and also wrote the famous book, The Day After Roswell. This book details his work on classified projects resulting from technologies found at the Roswell crash. In his accounts, he would make a statement that alludes to a similar treaty between the US and aliens. Corso wrote, "We had negotiated a kind of surrender with them, extraterrestrials, as long as we couldn't fight them. They dictated the terms because they knew what we feared most was disclosure." In 2004, an archivist at the Eisenhower Library, Jim Leerzaph, answered a few questions in an interview regarding this alleged alien meeting. When asked if this encounter ever took place, Jim said, "Not to our knowledge, there's nothing in the archives that indicates that." He laughs and then says, "We've had so many requests on that subject that we have a person who specializes in this." The specialist, Herb Pankratz, is an expert in forms of transportation. Jim commented on this, saying, "And we decided to add UFOs to that. He does trains, planes, automobiles, and flying saucers." Pankratz has stated the library gets this question over the years, and has said, "It's interesting to see how these stories have changed. Initially, the accounts claimed the president made a secret trip to Edwards Air Force Base to view the remains of aliens who had crashed at Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. Later, the stories claimed that he had actually visited with live aliens." Pankratz himself isn't a believer of this story and cites a book by historian and dental professor, A History of Dwight D. Eisenhower's Oral Health, written by James Mixon. Eisenhower's medical records were released to researchers in 1991, and Mixon was able to study these and make his own report of what happened. He reported that on the night of the 20th, back in 1954, President Eisenhower chipped the porcelain cap off his upper left central incisor and went to a Dr. Francis Purcell to have it repaired. Unfortunately, Dr. Purcell perished in 1974, and much of his patient records were never found. Mixon said, "The lack of a dental record from Purcell's office has helped fuel belief in this UFO encounter." However, he quickly added, "But the president has well-documented difficulties with this crown." He states that the crown was first installed in July 1952, and then was soon chipped and repaired just months after in December of that same year. This same crown would again be chipped and repaired in February 1954, the date of the alleged meeting, and then one last time in July that same year. In 2010, the Ministry of Defense released previously classified documents which included an account of a wartime meeting involving Winston Churchill. This document included a letter from a scientist who was also the grandson of a Royal Air Force member. The scientist asked about a confrontation he had heard about from his grandfather who served in World War II, in which an RAF aircraft had an encounter with a UFO. The scientist also claimed that his grandfather had heard Winston Churchill and Eisenhower discussing this, in which they decided to cover the whole thing up. Apparently, the Prime Minister was so concerned about this encounter with the UFO that he would order all information on it to be classified for at least 50 years to prevent mass panic. And if what the scientist says is true, his story suggests that Eisenhower already knew of UFOs and possibly aliens years before this alleged first contact. Even today, there are still many supporters of these theories. Dr. Michael Salla, head of Peace and Ambassador Program in Australia's Centre for Global Peace, is one of such believers. He researches UFOs in his free time and was never convinced by the Eisenhower went to the dentist story. He strongly believes that it was all a cover-up and the president really did go to meet with ETs that night. Salla offers his thoughts on the matter, saying, "There was telepathic communication. It's as though you're hearing a person, but they're not speaking. They were afraid we might blow up some of our nuclear technology, and apparently that does something to time and space, and it impacts on extraterrestrial races on other planets." Salla also believes that the US government was unwilling to give up nuclear weapons for exchange for spiritual wisdom. He continues by saying that sometime later the second race of aliens came with their own offer, and this time they made a deal with Eisenhower. Salla says that since the treaty was signed, the Greys have kidnapped millions of humans. Nowadays, reports of contact with extraterrestrials have changed drastically compared to how they were described 100 years ago. For the longest time, interactions with aliens were often described as a friendly encounter, with them often coming with the intent on helping us in some way. Many attribute this change to the treaty that was allegedly signed by Eisenhower and the Grey aliens. It's speculated that the Greys weren't as trustworthy as we might have expected. We know from abduction stories that they aren't the most gentle of creatures, often traumatizing their victims. But some wonder if we even had a choice in all this to begin with. Would we even be able to stop the Greys with our current level of technology? Although never directly mentioning aliens or any kind of treaty, General Douglas MacArthur would make a statement in October 1955 which seemed to be a warning. Many speculate that this warning was a reference to contact with extraterrestrials that could possibly be a threat to humanity as well. MacArthur would say in a speech, "The nations of this world will have to unite, for the next war will be an interplanetary war. The nations of the Earth must someday make a common front against attack by people from other planets." In the end, many of these people seem credible, but it's important to note that many of their backgrounds are just unknown. Whistleblowers claim that there is even a campaign to discredit anyone that comes forward with information. Some, such as William Cooper, have stated that their credentials and rank were stripped in an attempt to make them seem much less convincing, with any evidence that they were involved with secret projects wiped away. However, there is no proof of any of this in the long run, so we'll just have to take their word on it. On another note, it's also been said that the statement made by General Douglas MacArthur was taken from multiple speeches or was just straight up fabricated. In the end, it's up to you to decide what to believe. Thanks again for being here, guys, and leave a like and subscribe if you liked hearing about this conspiracy. Do you think Eisenhower actually signed a treaty with aliens? Comment with your thoughts down below if you think first contact really happened that night. Hope to see you guys next week. This was Matt, and I want to believe.